Every once in a while, I think it's important for me to get back to the whole reason I started my website, The Recovering Legalist: legalism within the church. Therefore, in the next few minutes, I will attempt to do two things. One, define legalism, and then give 5 possible reasons one might want to become or remain a legalist. Before we look at why a person would want to be a legalist, let's make sure we understand what legalism actually is. I'm going to give you 2 definitions that I think really sum it up well. The first one is from gotquestions.org, which I highly recommend, and I would advise reading the whole piece on their website. The following is just an excerpt. The word legalism does not occur in the Bible. It is a term Christians use to describe a doctrinal position emphasizing a system of rules and regulations for achieving both salvation and spiritual growth. Legalists believe in and demand a strict, literal adherence to rules and regulations. Doctrinally, it is a position essentially opposed to grace. Those who hold a legalistic position often fail to see the real purpose for the law, especially the purpose of the Old Testament law of Moses, which is to be our schoolmaster or tutor to bring us to Christ. Galatians 3:24. The second definition can actually be found on Wikipedia, of all places. Believe it or not, it is a pretty in-depth article. And again, here's just a portion. Legalism in Christian theology is a sometimes pejorative term referring to an overemphasis on discipline of conduct or legal ideas, usually implying an allegation of misguided rigor, pride, superficiality, the neglect of mercy, and ignorance of the grace of God, or emphasizing the letter of the law over the spirit. Legalism is alleged against any view that obedience to the law, not dependence on God's grace, is the preeminent principle of redemption. Legalism adheres to any doctrine which states salvation comes strictly from adherence to the law. It can be thought of as a works-based religion. But to be fair, most people that I would label as legalists do not believe salvation is earned by works of any kind. At least, if they're Baptist. No, the vast majority of legalists to which I refer, and to which I used to belong, use a system of rules and regulations to determine spirituality, spiritual growth, and favor with God and other believers. Legalists believe, as a whole, in the redemptive work of the cross, but set a universal standard which defines holiness for all who claim Christ, regardless of cultural or societal considerations. To the legalist, anyone who behaves or believes differently than his perceived standards must not be right with God. So what would make a person want to be or even remain a legalist? Well, the following 5 reasons are ones which I have observed throughout the years. There may be more, but here's 5. Number 1, some people don't know any different. When I was growing up, I did not know anything different than what I was exposed to in our small churches, missionary conferences, revivals, or Christian schools. Even though I believe that most of what I was taught was doctrinally sound, I was not allowed to examine any different viewpoints, even those of other Baptists, specifically if they were anything other than independent, fundamental, etc. Many are still in this situation, and tragically, they are content with their ignorance. They refuse to consider the fact that they may be wrong on a particular point. Even when Scripture is plain and simple, Because of the secluded nature of certain groups, legalists would rather stick their heads in the sand than risk being wrong. Being wrong might make someone else, even another denomination, right about something, and heaven forbid that happen. Well, number two, some came from an unholy lifestyle and now seek to redeem themselves or their consciences. Some people are so ashamed of their past that they go overboard in trying to live a life of holiness. They see in their past a link between so-called worldly activities and their fall into depravity. In an effort to show they are no longer the person they used to be, and in order to avoid, temptation, they strictly avoid certain activities deemed worldly. Sadly, even though they mean well, they project their own weaknesses onto others, therefore expecting others to abide by the same level of austere living or be seen as worldly. However, in many cases, appearances are not what they seem. The very ones who are so legalistic in some areas of life wind up being the ones with the biggest weaknesses in that area. Their overbearing attitudes, in many cases, may only be the big doors hiding skeletons in their closet. Number three, some desire to be controlled, to be told what to do. As strange as it may sound, some people don't like to think for themselves, nor do they like being responsible for their own choices. It's sort of like people whom I've seen that were once under a totalitarian government. When they no longer had a dictatorial system telling them what to do, they either lost all control or had no motivation to do any good. Legalistic churches provide the lazy or immature Christian a list of do's and don'ts so that he doesn't have to search the Scripture for guidance. It is much easier that way. If the pastor says something is wrong and that God would not approve, then that's it. End of discussion. Having a list is safe and doesn't require much thought. Essentially, the legalist would rather be a marionette than mature. Number four, some may want to control others. Freedom is dangerous. Freedom allows for movement and change. Freedom allows for the individual to be led by God in a specific direction that may or may not be God's will for another. Freedom takes power away from those who would want to control others for their own edification or gratification. On the other hand, legalism keeps the sheep under strict control by encouraging tattling and fear of being ostracized. There are pastors, well-intended men, who would rather their people live under a specific set of guidelines than question long-held man-made traditions. These leaders are afraid to lose their congregations to the world, but also to other churches. They may even find comfort in controlling others due to their own inadequacies. Much like emperors and dictators, they manipulate weak Christians in order to maintain their little kingdoms. Rarely do they admit weakness and often micromanage every aspect of ministry. Legalistic leaders have to be in control. And number five, some people are more afraid of God than in love with Him. So many people that I have known and used to be like were more afraid of losing their relational standing with God than anything else. Legalism tends to give some the assurance that God is pleased with them. I wonder how it really was for Enoch as he walked with God. Many modern preachers are quick to make the application of Enoch's walk with God to the way we act in this world. But they make little of the relationship implied by the narrative in Genesis 5, verse 24. In reality, very few lists would even be needed if one just had an abiding relationship with Jesus Christ. To the legalist, God is not a friend. He doesn't laugh. He speaks in Old English, and he holds a grudge because of what it took to buy the sinner's salvation. When one thinks of God as always looking for an opportunity to send judgment, then being legalistic is the safest way to go. No one wants to be hit with a lightning bolt. So are you legalistic? Why or why not? Are there any reasons I missed in that list? Can you add any? Let me know in the comment section below. Until next time, God bless and rest in His grace.